everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Scaling People podcast. I'm your host, Rasika Rajagopalan, and today I am so glad to be chatting with Donald Knight, or DK, as he's better known, SVP of People at Warner Brothers. DK has a superpower of experiences. Prior to Warner Brothers, he served as the Chief People Officer at Greenhouse. DK has also led people teams across so many different industries, as noted by his time at Equifax, Southern Company Gas, and the Defense Commission Agency. So he has seen firsthand the unique challenges that organizations across all these different industries face. And I'm so excited to get into all that. So DK, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Roscoe, what's going on?
I am
It's good to
so
see you.
excited. It is so good to see you. I know you are a busy man traveling around the world. And so this is such a cool moment. So, speaking a little of your background, having worked in a number of industries, tech, entertainment, utilities, I'm curious in your experience, how do the primary challenges in people and talent leadership differ? And on the flip side, are there any universal challenges that you have seen across the board?
Absolutely. First of all, I would say you are quite the traveler as well, because I have seen you in California on two different occasions, and it wasn't in the same day or week. So I do think that is very
Fair
telling.
enough. Fair
Um,
enough.
I think some of the challenges are rather similar, right? I think what I have observed is the size of the challenge and the impact that it may have on the culture changes based on how large or how established the company is. I'll give you an example. When I was at Greenhouse Software, I remember when we had less than 400 employees. I remember when we got up to nearly 900 employees. And the challenges that we saw were very similar to big company challenges. The difference is that the impact to the people, you're impacting 70, 80, 90% of the org because it's only but so big, as opposed to when you look at organizations like Equifax, or even where I'm at today, which is Warner Brothers Discovery. you know, these companies have thousands upon thousands of employees. And so the challenges may be the same, but how many people that they impact, or how many people feel what those challenges may feel like on a day-to-day basis, that varies because the organizations are so big. Said differently, I found it very similarly in how you like navigate the ship of change. People still struggle with, change and making sure you have the right level of change communications and setting strategy, but the impact of it varies based on the size of the org.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's so well said. I'm sure, kind of on that point of change, although a lot of these industries, it probably feels like your challenges are unique. Kind of when you really sort of strip away, a lot of the sort of outside and look at the core, there's, always constant disruption on the surface. While the sort of flavor might be different, the core issues are the same, where, you're kind of thinking about AI replacing jobs, and tech's kind of thinking about that, entertainment sort of dealing with like a creative workforce that's now kind of thinking about the impact that AI has. So on the surface, I think what's happening in the world kind of impacts the sort of day-to-day work experience. And while the challenges might be slightly different industry to industry, some of those sort of like root causes may actually be very similar.
I totally agree with you. I think at our core, we're all human. And so when we hear about change, we typically have the same initial reactions. Our anxiety and our fears are also very similar, but our wants and our desires are also very similar. So, like, people want to be fulfilled in the workplace. People want to have a leader that cares about their growth and development. Those things don't change just based on the size of the org or the industry that you work in. How those things are developed and how those things are communicated, those may change based on whatever industry or the size of your org.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Well, you recently started a new role at Warner Brothers Discovery. So, congratulations. So exciting. They're so
Thank
lucky to
you.
have you. I'm curious, I believe this might be your sort of first role in more of like the entertainment space. And so I'm curious what your approach is to onboarding as a new leader, particularly as you're getting to know maybe a new industry.
That's a great question. I think you're spot on. This is my first time being in a direct role in entertainment. I've been in the media and advertising space with Edelman, but not in entertainment. I think the way that I try to go about onboarding is I feel, and I try to do this regardless of industry, I try to make sure I take a valued interest in whatever industry I'm choosing to pursue prior to even getting an offer letter. And the reason for that is I feel it is hard to demonstrate a certain level of value if you don't have a certain level of
Mhm.
context. And so for me, like making sure I understand the shift from linear to streaming, making sure that I understand like how you see big tech entering the media landscape with, Amazon Prime adding the NFL and going after NBA rights, or being able to understand that Netflix was not only leading in the amount of people that they have that are monthly subscribers, but also realizing like what are the differences between originals versus shows that they're licensing. I really wanted to understand that context prior to even like putting my name in the hat. I think the other thing that I think is very helpful in onboarding is like the importance of a listening tour. Because I think a lot of times people will say, "Oh, I've been there, done that." And while you may have a plethora of experiences that are very applicable to your new role, taking the time to listen to the people that have already been there is absolutely priceless. There's a great book. I was just talking to a young man right before this named JT, and we were both like basically like nerding out on the importance of this book called The First 90 Days.
Mm.
And I think that book is should be required reading for anyone that's starting a new job, because listening tours for me have allowed me to understand what are some of the strengths of the organization that I don't need to go change because the organization is already excelling there. But also, like, what are the pain points that people are witnessing on a day to day basis? And what I could do there is like figuring out radical prioritization. What are some of the low hanging fruit that I can do, address, that will let people know that they were seen, valued, and heard during that listening tour? And then I try to use those things or those priorities to shape whatever strategy I want to roll out, and then use that strategy to inform whatever structural changes I may make to the team or suggest to the teams that I'm supporting. So I think the listening tour for me is number two, but number one, making sure that you have context about the industry and doing your homework.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you kind of shared, before you even started learning a little bit more about the market. I think as people leaders, we're just as much business leaders as, any other sort of executive in the C-suite. And I think the best way to kind of really bring that business value to the table is to know just as much as anyone else, sort of like how the company makes money, what are the competitors doing, like what should we be thinking about, and being kind of proactive and kind of applying that to a people lens. I also love how you brought up the first 90 days because that is such a critical window, particularly as you are learning a new industry. I'm curious how you balance learning the business in that first 90 days while also trying to make an immediate impact and having some quick wins from the get-go.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe learning the industry starts before you actually start. So it should be part of pre-boarding,
Mm.
right? I think now that I'm here, the things that I get to learn are the nuances associated with my employer.
Mm.
What's nuanced for our team, our technology, our global footprint, stories that we want to tell, whether they be originals or whether they be reboots or spin-offs or sequels or prequels. Like that's where the learning for me is acclimating and really trying to dig into my conversations to somewhat uncover what I don't know. I've done that. I've tried to stage that through three lenses. The first 30 days, I typically focus on one-to-one conversations. So everyone on my team and all of the senior leaders on the teams that I support, all of those are one-to-one conversations. The next 30 days, which I just kicked off, are the one to many conversations where I'm doing what I call table for 10, where I bring 10 folks on the team with myself and I get to unpack asking some of the same questions around strengths and opportunities for the org, but I'm aggregating it at a much faster clip because I have so many different voices in the room at the same time.
Mm.
And then the last 30 days of the first 90 is me really working with a data scientist to figure out what are some of the themes that I'm seeing across the various business units. What are themes for the leaders that I'm supporting that are executives, and really trying to figure out what are some of the radical priorities that I should be doing, but I should also be partnering with others to be able to make a more immediate impact, but also trying to figure out what are the longer term impacts that we're trying to make. And what I have found, like I had the opportunity of talking to our chairman and CEO of sports earlier today. I actually started my day with him. Phenomenal human. And I just gave him the high level themes from the conversations I've had thus far. He's like, Donald, this is so valuable. Like, why did you do this? And I just share with him like how I have seen this be beneficial in acclimating, especially at big companies. And I felt like his affirmation to me on what I was sharing with him, even though I was just literally regurgitating the themes that I extracted from others, only helped further show him how much I was prioritizing learning our business, learning our
Mhm.
team, and trying to figure out how I can impact our future. And so, like, for me, like, that's how I typically have tried to navigate learning a new business and trying to understand the context of the business and what state it may be in at that time.
Yeah, I love that. I think that, your ability to kind of go at all levels, it really gives you sort of different pieces of the picture. And often, sometimes as a new person, you think, or maybe I think like, oh, like what value do I have? I just got here. But sometimes it's that fresh perspective and fresh set of eyes that once you're sort of in the machine and you're so in the weeds and you're so into the day to day, you actually like lose that lens. And so being able to capture that and share that with other leaders in a way that is really helpful to them, I think is incredible. So a lot of these things that you've talked about are really great trust builders with leadership and other key stakeholders. Are there other ways that you established credibility early on, particularly in an industry where maybe, you don't have as much like industry experience?
Absolutely. I think the first thing I want to say though is shout outs to Patrick Lencioni. Establishing trust is the foundation of any relationship. And so if it sounds like, I'm glad that it sounds like I prioritize that because I have found that to be the core of the relationships that you have. And like even at my prior employers, there are relationships that I have there that were established in the first 90 days that have now bloomed years later. And the connectivity is there, of which is one person you and I know in common who I affectionately call Chef, but Minji. And most people don't even know why I call her Chef, but we connected on her story as being the child of restaurant owners. And I wanted to understand what that looked and felt like. And this was early on when we started working together. And I took an interest in a show that she recommended that would give me insight into how her upbringing was as a human.
Oh.
And so, yes, that trust is very important. I think the other thing, though, that people, or some other things that people can do when trying to acclimate or trying to gain that context that helps build very strong, powerful relationships is not just listening, but being able to figure out how some of your past exposure or past experiences are relevant to the conversations that you are now present
Hmm.
for. I'll give you an example. Earlier this week, we were talking about attrition, and I have a phenomenal colleague who was doing the presentation. And when I tell you, not only did he come prepared with his data, but he understood the five themes that he was trying to convey to the team. He understood what are the pain points that the leaders around the table would want to like have additional conversation on. And the thing that I kind of shared during that time was basically leaning on my time leading a global talent team. And I was like, hey, like I think what would also be a value add is not just this attrition data, but our attraction data.
Mm.
And everybody in the rooms, their ears perked up. They're like, what do you mean by attraction data? I'm like, well, we typically talk about, like, let's say top talent. We always talk about, like, how do you evaluate top talent? How are you growing them? How are you making sure that you're developing them, right? And then people typically talk about succession slates. And when they leave, some companies call them regrettable turnover. But more importantly, most leaders are just like, dang, this sucks because we invested so much money and so much time into Raska and she's leaving. I'm like, yeah, but the reality is that's affirmation that another company saw value in the same person you identified as top
Yep.
talent. And so we got to get comfortable with trying to figure out number one, what is the threshold of top talent that we're willing to see leave the
Hmm.
organization, which is somewhat kudos to us for developing them, that other people find them valuable. But then number two, what are we doing to attract top talent? How are we assessing the new hires that we're bringing in? Are you replacing them on a one for one? Because you could actually leapfrog the impact that the company is having if you can go attract talent higher than the talent that's leaving. So, like, if you hired someone that was more junior and you were developing them and they grew into a new opportunity, you could use that opportunity to go find someone with an even higher
Right.
level of expertise, right? And so, trying to make sure you look at both not just attrition data, but attraction data to figure out later on in life Most people call it the say it's part of an employee lifetime value, or looking at talent
Mhm.
density, or looking at quality of hire. All of these things are in the same, what I consider talent gumbo, and trying to figure out like what's the right flavor that we're trying to strike.
Right, right.
And so you could just see all of the bells and whistles flying off for people in the room around, oh my goodness, I remember when I hired Johnny, and Johnny, we developed Johnny and he left. But then when I hired Jane, Jane was even stronger than Johnny and had even more experience. So being able to help contribute to the conversation by drawing upon prior experiences from roles that I had exposure to, I have found that to also help build credibility, because now people can then say, I see why Rosika was hired.
Yeah.
Like I see how she connects the dots to help drive meaningful
Yeah,
conversation.
that's such a good example. And I do like that you brought up an example around retention, because oftentimes even with managers, sometimes, like somebody will leave the team and they'll panic. And obviously you don't want every single person leaving, but to some point, like if you're a really strong manager and you're developing people, like they're going to grow and they're going to continue to take their skills to other organizations. So that's good. And also, sometimes the company evolves so much, that the role evolves so much, that maybe some new thinking, or an individual with a slightly different sort of background or interest might actually be a better fit for the job at this point in time. So kind of like asking the question why, as you look at some of these numbers, and that's such a valuable role that you play as you kind of bring the data and the insights together. Kind of looking at some of these patterns that you've observed over time is so impactful. So I'm curious, have you ever, as you are, kind of entering these new organizations, have you ever encountered industry specific assumptions or biases that you had to challenge as a new leader? And how did you navigate that?
No, that never happens. Yeah, I think there's been a number of times where, I mean, if you look at just hiring, having conversations with leaders that say that a person has to have a certain level, a certain set of experiences. I would say this from my time in tech.
Mm,
When I look at some of the folks that we hired at the last company that I was with, I remember when I first got there hearing about what types of talent profiles were required in order for us to go find, a quality hire or someone that we believed could create impact. And I personally tried to push against that notion, because I believe that people can have transferable experiences that allow them to be even more impactful. I also believe that sometimes when you're looking for people who have only worked in a certain industry, that they lack some of the perspectives, fresh perspectives, particularly of reimagining what success for the company could be, or how things could be impactful. And I'll give you an example. I remember when I was trying to figure out what kind of leader, what was going to be my first hire. And your first hire as a leader, for anyone listening, sends a clear signal to what you prioritize.
mhm,
Everyone's monitoring to see, is it an inclusive process? What type of background are you looking for? And things of that nature. So my first hire at my last organization, that gentleman, he had never worked in applicant tracking systems before. It was his first time being an executive. He was a senior director. We were hiring for a VP, but no one can reject the impact that he has been able to make at that organization, in establishing and partnering with people like Minji to establish what it looks like to have programmatic learning and development, and what it looks like to make sure that you're able to build quicker opportunities for leaders to be able to react to sentiment inside of the organization. And the reason why he was so impactful is because he hadn't worked at a company that small
mhm.
before. Because he had seen the scale, he had had exposure to what it took to take our company and get it to its full potential. And so I use that as an example to say sometimes having that fresh perspective and seeking out those fresh perspectives can literally change who you hire, and then who you hire can then go on to change the value and the impact they're driving for the organization. I kind of wish, this is between you and I don't know who's going to create this product. I don't have the time to do it, But you know, like with a car, how you have a Carfax report and you can find out if Donald made a crash
Mhm.
before you bought
Mhm.
it or it was in a hurricane or what have you. I really wish we had a Carfax report for talent.
Mm.
Because how many times have we seen, if we look across multiple industries, how many times have we seen someone be discounted during the interview process and then go on and be a rock star inside of an
Totally,
organization?
totally, totally. Yeah. Good
So,
one, good
yeah.
one. I love that example. I think it kind of speaks to this idea that especially when you're challenging a lot of these outcomes or challenging a lot of these assumptions rather, you know, that sort of first one is kind of challenging at times, but then the sometimes the results end up speaking a little louder than maybe the potential disruption that you caused. And so really it's about like continuing to take these calculated bets or, sort of thinking about the precedent that you want to set and how you're going to kind of continue to allow the results to show for themselves and then ultimately kind of becomes more baked into the company culture. So I love that. Speaking of company culture, oftentimes that can in some ways be tied to the industry that you're in. Tech has sort of a very distinct culture, finance has a distinct culture. Every industry sort of has its distinct culture. So how do you shape or influence a company culture that aligns with those industry norms yet still kind of stands out as something unique and authentic?
Yeah. I think it is both fortunate and unfortunate that industries have preconceived cultures associated with them. I think the fortunate thing is that there's some level of consistency,
Hmm.
right? And so if you go from working for this tech company to go working for another one, more often than not, there's some level of similarities, right? Either based on the types of professions you have there, like let's say engineers or SDRs or insert whatever. So the fortunate thing is that it's consistency. And that then allows people to be rather intentional about where they go park their time, talent, and treasure because they can somewhat expect things to be more similar than dissimilar. I think the problem that I have with that, which I think is the unfortunate part, is that it doesn't allow for other creative, talented people to find a home in those industries.
Hmm.
When they find themselves in those industries, it could feel isolating,
Hmm.
or they may not be given the opportunity because they don't remind you of someone because they didn't work for 5, 10, 15 years in one industry. And so for me, when you talk about, well, how do you go to impact those cultures, I think the first thing I try to do is figure out aspirationally where do we want our company culture to be, and somewhat disassociate ourselves from the industry.
Hmm.
um, if where we're trying to be aspirationally is different from the industry, I'm okay with that. I think that is more inviting.
Hmm.
And I mean, the studies show when you have people from diverse backgrounds with diversity of thought, you're going to be more profitable
Of
anyway.
course.
So, like this notion of only hiring from within the same monoculture because of the industry is very the same. I don't know if that's ideal. I think I think if you look at any of the companies that have been disruptive, look at the most profitable transportation company on the planet right now. That guy was never in transportation,
Yeah, fair enough.
right? So, what would have happened if we only allowed people in transportation to reimagine what that looked like, what that industry looked like? And so that to me is, I think, just one example. I'm sure there's tons of examples whether you're looking at, like, we're in the storytelling business, right? And so sometimes that shows up in film, sometimes it shows up in short story, sometimes it shows up in live broadcasts like sports. But imagine, like, if Shonda Rhimes was not allowed to be able to make movies because she didn't come from movies, or if you didn't have certain writers and producers that were included, I think we would miss out on the creations that they've created. And so for me, I always try to link what my impact to the culture on where we're trying to get aspirationally,
Hmm.
and then have my actions and behaviors influence in that direction.
Hmm.
And if that means it's more of the same in the industry, great. But I have often found that's not the case.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think for what it's worth, every industry is sort of blending together at this point. Like, I currently work at a prop tech company. There's very much that real estate culture baked into the tech culture that we have. There are health tech
Yeah.
companies, fintech companies, media companies are super tech enabled these days. And so there are all these sort of blends that are happening as our world gets smaller. And I think that's a great opportunity to kind of continue to learn from these subcultures that have emerged and sort of the best that we can take from each one of those. And so I'm curious, what lessons can people leaders take from one industry and apply to another? Have you seen any practices in media or entertainment or any other industry that you've worked in that you think could work well in a tech company or vice versa?
Yeah, I think there's some core things. I think the first one is I do think storytelling is a universal skill set that helps positively influence culture, especially when the more difficult the story, the more it counts.
Hmm.
So I think difficult stories, what's an example of that? Social injustice or the observation, social unrest.
Hmm.
I think you might want to have a good story on where the company what's the company
Hmm.
stands or what the company will do. I know recently we had a hurricane where I live, like being able to communicate to folks that were negatively impacted during that time, that story matters. Letting them know that what they just went through matters. I think the other power of storytelling is things like you think about difficult stories like reductions in force or layoffs. The stories that you tell people matter about them being valued regardless of being in positions or no longer having a position with the organization. Those stories matter. So I think that's a universal skill set. I think another universal skill set is like making sure that you're creating a sense of belonging in
Hmm.
environments, letting people know that regardless of where you landed on the planet, that you can unlock value and unlock your potential at this organization. Making sure that you have that, I think, is helpful, especially as you're navigating change. So whether you're buying companies, merging companies, integrating companies together, growing companies, I think people want to know, like, is this environment still good for me? And then I think the last one, which is something that I'm kind of bullish on, Rasika, because it's just like I've benefited from it, is like growth and development.
Hmm.
Like people are there are so many humans right now who are in search of being at employers that they can go reach their highest heights and learn the most that they can. And so the leadership that it takes to be able to truly invest in someone else's growth and development is something that I think is universal, regardless of what industry you work in. So I'm sure that is not exhaustive of all the things that are universal, but those are a handful that I think I have found that I've benefited from and I've tried to champion.
Yeah, I love that. That's amazing. And one of my favorite things about your approach, especially in the past, as we've talked about, unique challenges and sort of the people space and the stories that are told about the work that we do, is you always kind of think about, well, like how can we be the change? Like what's the work that we can do to change the narrative or, to be the solution in some ways. And so maybe to wrap, I'm curious, as you kind of think about the sort of evolving world of work over the next 5 to 10 years, what is, if there's like one specific thing that you're really focused on at your organization, you think lots of other organizations should be thinking about this very specific thing, what is that, and what are you kind of personally sort of working on or doing to solve that issue that you see?
OMG, this is great. I wish I could only limit it to one thing. I'm gonna say 2. I know you gave me 1. I'm really good at listening, but
Give me two,
I
give
think
me
the
two.
2 the two things that I'm most passionate about right now. Number 1, changing the human experience at work. I think there's a ton of creativity that we have that we're unable to tap into because we're bogged down in, like, mess. And there's a tons of things I would put into the mess basket.
Mm-hmm.
Unnecessary meetings is mess. Manual processes is
Mm-hmm.
mess. Not allowing for more human collaboration in whether that be in person or async, but more human collaboration. I think we're all bogged down. Like we got all this mess we're dealing with. And so we can't even bring our greatest ideas to life because we're bogged down in like the day to day. And that changes the human experience, right? Like we shouldn't have a negative association when it comes to work. Like when people tell me they have the Monday blues, I'm like, why? Like, why is that the case? And my hope is that with AI, we can help change some of that by changing some of the mundane, monotonous, routine things. I think if we can deploy AI there, we can then positively shift the human experience. That's the first one. And the second thing that I'm equally passionate about, some people have told me I'm more passionate about, and that's okay. I'm happy to be more passionate about this, is historically companies in this country and on this planet, not just in this country, the overwhelming majority of those countries have been ran by men. And like, I'm not anti-man. Like I am one. Like when I joined, it asked what was my pronoun. My pronouns are he, his, him. Like at the same time, I can't help but think that there is a ton of potential if we diversify the most non-diverse role on the planet, which is the role of the CEO.
Mhm.
And so, as a big brother, as a husband, and a father of a 7-month-old now, a little girl, like I am on a mission to figure out how can we get boards and leadership teams at the highest level to not only feel comfortable, because this isn't about comfort. I want them to be excited, advocate for more women as CEO. That is my goal. I've personally made it a mission to make sure that I partner with some of the most amazing women CEOs on the planet. And I want to make sure I'm super familiar with their business. Mary at GM is one of them. Sarah Franklin at Lattice is another. Wendy Thomas at SecureWorks. But I am taking a vested interest in making sure not only do I track their quarterly earnings, but I'm trying to make sure that I am available to make sure that they can be as successful as they can be in those seats, because I want to see more women in those seats moving forward.
Yeah, amazing. Well, I so appreciate you, DK. Thank you so much for coming on the show and for sharing so many great takeaways and such an insightful chat as always. So,
Nah, thank you for having me. This is so easy to talk to you. And I look forward, maybe we can do a part two later on and we'll see if the CEO thing has changed and who knows? I might be talking to a CEO right now.
aw, you're the best. Well, until next time, DK. Thanks again.